Imagine for me, if you will, that you were involved in an accident and that a loved one is killed. Later on in court, you find out that the killer of your loved one has a very unhealthy habit of not wearing a seatbelt. Now, if only a few years later the seatbelt laws had been repealed, you wouldn't even be in this mess. Well, what does the repealing of seatbelt laws have to do with the death of a loved one? Let me explain. If the seatbelt laws were to be repealed, through the modes of natural selection, the roads would eventually become a safer place. Still confused? Let me explain in 3 phases. My first point I would like to make is seatbelts themselves. They're very useful. What we don't need is the laws. You see, seatbelts themselves, according to the Idaho Department of Transportation, prevent about 50% of injuries in car crashes and are 60 to 70% effective in reducing fatalities. The law regarding seatbelts themselves simply states that your seatbelt must be engaged when the vehicle is in motion. Simple enough? Well, as simple as the law is, the punishment is even simpler. The fines only range between $10 and $50. Now, this isn't a very harsh punishment, but it's enough to get those who wouldn't otherwise wear their seatbelts engage them. Put that in the back of your mind for a moment, if you will. I want to move on to my second point, the law of natural selection. Robert Brandon, a student at Stanford University, says biological evolution requires reproducing entities that form lineages. It is these lineages that evolve. Now, this simply means that we as humans are categorized in this, and we undergo biological evolution. One type of this evolution I would like to focus on is called the law of natural selection. He goes on to say that natural selection is a casual process. Typically, there is a variation among organisms. Oftentimes, this variation is heritable. When this variation is casually connected to differential ability to survive and reproduce, differential reproduction will probably ensue. Now, in English, that simply means that if an organism has a trait that allows it to survive, that trait will be passed on to its offspring. Now, bring your attention back to the seatbelt laws. Simply put, that if the seatbelt laws were repealed, then those who wouldn't normally wear their seatbelts wouldn't have a cause to, and would eventually die in a car crash. And this would, of course, make roads safer for everybody else. And if they die, then they won't be able to pass on that trait to their offspring, so to speak. This brings me to my third point, the connection between not wearing your seatbelt and other unsafe driving habits. Let me compare this with an analogy. How can we expect a man who can't afford to buy bread for his family to own a flat-screen TV? It simply doesn't make sense. The same laws apply to simple driving habits. If you can't obey the simple laws, how can we expect you to obey the bigger ones? Simply put, the disobedience of a simple law could lead to the disobedience of a bigger, more important law, which makes unsafe driving habits, which constitutes a dangerous driver. Now, if the seatbelt laws were to be repealed, then those who wouldn't have reason to wear their seatbelts, they simply wouldn't wear them. And eventually, if they were involved in a crash, this would mean that they were much more likely to die. And unfortunately, the upside to that is that it makes the roads safer. And as Brandon has said, it does take time. But studies have actually shown that this theory is actually very accurate. According to USA Today, at least 42% of police officers killed in vehicle crashes over the past 3 decades were not wearing seatbelts. To show the law of natural selection at work, the article goes on to say, of the officers killed in vehicle crashes, 28% used some kind of restraint in the 1980s. According to the NHTSA report. In the 1990s, that number moved up to 58 to 56%. Now, we obviously see here that drivers with unsafe habits who don't use their seatbelts do unfortunately die, which that does make the road safer. In this case, the safe driving habits in just 10 years went up by 25%. Now, as we have seen, not using your seatbelt could be a sign of other unsafe driving habits. And if the seatbelt laws were to be repealed, well, it would make the roads safer to drive on through the laws of natural selection. All I ask of you is to see this as a viable option for making our roads safer. Now, it's unlikely that any state will repeal its seatbelt laws, but please, remember to buckle up.